Security, remove him now! Lady Crow, please, there is no need for this. I won't have you here. Get out!
Very well. But this is not over.
You! How dare you trespass here?
I am no trespasser, madam. This is my right.
You're right. This is an outrage. Explain yourself.
In due time, Lady Crow. Patience.
I stood at the grand entrance of Thornvale Estate, chest heaving, voice sharp as cut glass, and pointed one trembling finger directly at the tall, broad-shouldered man who had just walked through the iron gates like he owned every stone, every blade of grass, every breath of air on the grounds. Security! Remove him! Now! The footmen froze. The butler's eyes went wide. Even the horses at the post seemed to hold still. Because the man I was pointing at, the man I was ordering dragged off the property, was not a trespasser. He was Casveth Dorn, the Duke of Greyvorn, and this was his estate. Every servant knew it. Every stone knew it. The ivy climbing those ancient walls had known his name longer than I had been alive. But I did not know. Not yet. I stood there, chin raised, hands balled into fists at my sides, every inch of me radiating the kind of fury that only comes when someone believes, truly believes, they are completely in the right. And he looked at me, not with anger, not with the cold dismissal a man of his rank would normally offer a stranger who dared command his staff. He looked at me like I was the most fascinating thing that had ever had the boldness to stand on his land. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted. "Remove me?" he said, his voice low, almost amused. "From my own home? Now, before we go further, tell me this. If you were in my place and you found out the truth at that very moment, what would you have done? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this already has your heart racing, hit subscribe. You do not want to miss what happens next.
But this is not over.
I am here to see the master of Thornvale Estate. I have a letter and documents that demand his immediate attention. He will want to see me.
I did not arrive at Thornvale Estate with fear in my heart. I arrived with a letter, a sealed order bearing the crest of the Greyvorn Estate trustees, and the full weight of legal authority behind every step I took through those iron gates. My name is Lady Thessaly Crow, and I had been appointed acting custodian of Thornvale Estate by the Board of Trustees of the Greyvorn Holdings, effective the first day of the month. Duke Casveth Dorn of Greyvorn had been absent for 3 years. 3 full years without a single word, without a visit, without even the courtesy of a letter to his own staff. The estate had fallen into quiet disarray, bills unpaid, tenants unanswered. The west wing roof had begun to cave in 2 separate places. The trustees, tired of waiting for a ghost to return and take responsibility, had placed the estate temporarily under my management until the matter of the Duke's continued absence could be resolved by the courts. I had done this before, twice. I had managed the Calderton properties after Lord Calderton's death left his affairs in complete ruin. I had also overseen the temporary administration of Hopbury Manor during a bitter disputed inheritance. I was not a woman who walked into crumbling houses and wept. I walked in with ledgers, sharpened quills, and a very clear sense of what needed doing. Thornvale was different, though. Even I could feel it the moment the carriage rolled through the main gate. The estate was vast, ancient, and achingly beautiful in the way that only neglected things can be. The oak trees lining the entrance path were enormous, their branches reaching toward each other overhead like old friends clasping hands across a great divide. The gravel beneath the carriage wheels was overgrown at the edges. The fountain at the center of the courtyard had gone dry, its stone basin filled with dead leaves and the quiet evidence of too many seasons without care. But the bones of the place were magnificent. Anyone with eyes could see that. I stepped out of the carriage before the footman could assist me. I had learned long ago that waiting for assistance in moments that required decisiveness only undermined the authority one needed to establish from the very first second. I smoothed my skirts, lifted my chin, and turned to face the line of staff assembled along the entrance steps. There were 11 of them. A butler, 3 footmen, 2 housemaids, a cook, a groundskeeper, and 3 others whose roles I had not yet confirmed. They stood in a crooked, uncertain line, their expressions caught somewhere between curiosity and wariness. They did not know what to make of me. That was perfectly fine. They would learn. The butler stepped forward first. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and the deeply lined face of someone who had spent decades holding himself together through difficult circumstances. His name was Mr. Pendreth, and he had served the Greyvorn household for 31 years. He bowed stiffly. "My lady, we received word of your appointment only yesterday. I must confess the staff is not entirely prepared for—" "That is quite all right, Mr. Pendreth," I said, cutting him off cleanly but not unkindly. "I did not come expecting a celebration. I came to work. I should like a full tour of the estate beginning with the West Wing, a complete account of all outstanding debts, and a list of every tenant complaint that has gone unanswered in the past 12 months. Can you arrange all of that by this afternoon?" He blinked. Once. Then he straightened his already straight back even further and said, "Yes, my lady." "Good. Then let us begin." The tour shook me more than I expected. The West Wing was worse than the trustees had described. 2 entire rooms had been sealed because the ceiling had partially collapsed. The library smelled of damp and long abandonment. Several oil portraits lining the upper hallway had water stains creeping up their gilt frames. One portrait in particular, large and positioned at the top of the staircase landing, was so obscured by shadow and water damage that I could make out almost nothing of the face within it. I moved past it without a second thought. I spent the rest of the day buried in ledgers with Mr. Pendreth beside me, and a young estate clerk named Otby, scratching notes as fast as his hand could manage. The debt was significant, but not catastrophic. The tenant complaints were numerous but solvable. I drafted 4 letters before supper and sent 2 of them by express messenger before dark. By the time I retired that evening, I had already begun to feel the shape of what Thornvale could become under proper care. It was not a lost cause. It was a sleeping one. But something about that shadowed portrait at the top of the stairs stayed in the back of my mind all night like a splinter I could not quite reach. I should have looked closer. Everything that was about to happen to me might have been avoided entirely if I had simply stopped and looked closer at that portrait. But I did not. And so the following morning arrived, and with it, the full force of my destruction. The second morning at Thornvale began with cold, sharp autumn clarity. I was dressed and seated at the writing desk before the housemaids had finished lighting the downstairs fires. I had a meeting scheduled with Mr. Quebb, the groundskeeper, regarding the drainage ditches along the east field, and I intended to send an urgent letter to the trustees requesting emergency funds for the West Wing roof before the winter rains made the damage irreversible. I was in the middle of composing that letter when the commotion started outside, not the quiet, ordinary kind of disturbance that happens when a delivery cart loses a wheel. These were sharp voices, urgent boots on gravel, and a tension in the air that reached all the way up through the window glass and settled at the base of my throat. I set down my quill and looked out. A tall figure was walking through the open iron gate with the kind of slow, absolute confidence that immediately puts every nerve on edge. He was not rushing. He was not announcing himself. He walked as though the gate, the gravel, and the very air of the estate had been expecting him and had no right to do anything but part and allow him through. Behind him came 2 others, a broad, serious-looking man carrying a leather traveling case, and a younger man struggling beneath what appeared to be an unreasonable quantity of luggage. A carriage was pulling away down the lane behind them as though its only task was now complete. I was out of my chair before I had made any conscious decision to move. I came down the stairs so quickly that Mr. Pendrath, who was crossing the entrance hall below, had to step aside sharply to avoid a collision. I did not stop to explain myself. I went straight through the front door and down the entrance steps and positioned myself at the bottom, directly in the path of the approaching man. He was closer now, close enough to see clearly. Tall, considerably taller than I had estimated from the window. Dark hair grown slightly beyond what fashion typically permitted. A face that was all sharp angles and quiet severity, the kind of face that did not waste itself on easy expressions. His coat was travel-worn, but unmistakably fine. He carried no hat, and his eyes, when they found mine across the remaining distance between us, were a pale and unusual color that sat somewhere between gray and green and refused to be pinned down to either. He did not slow down. I raised one hand. "Stop right there." He stopped. Not because my hand alarmed him. I could see that perfectly well. He stopped because he decided to, and that distinction alone was enough to make my jaw tighten. "This is a private estate currently under the legal authority of the Greyvorn Board of Trustees," I said, keeping my voice level and carrying. "I am Lady Thessaly Crow, acting custodian of Thornvale, appointed by sealed order. You are on private grounds without invitation or prior announcement. State your name and your business, or I will have you removed immediately." Silence. The two men behind him had gone completely still. From the corner of my eye, I could see Mr. Pendrath at the top of the entrance steps with both hands clasped very tightly behind his back. One of the footmen appeared in the doorway, and then immediately retreated. Mr. Quebb came around the side path, took one look at the scene unfolding before him, and quietly turned back the way he had come. I turned my full attention back to the man at the gate. He was watching me with that steady, unreadable calm, and there was something at the corner of his mouth now, not quite a smile, something considerably more unsettling than a smile. "You would have me removed," he said. Not a question, a repetition, as though he were tasting the words and finding them remarkable. "Security," I called out sharply, turning my head just enough to project toward the entrance. "Remove him from these grounds at once." Nobody moved. Not a single person moved. The footman who had reappeared in the doorway found something deeply fascinating on the floor tiles. Mr. Pendrath pressed his lips together and looked at a fixed point somewhere above my head. Even the two men behind the stranger remained perfectly motionless, though I noticed the serious one with the leather case had developed the careful expression of a man trying very hard not to react to something. I turned back. The man looked at me with those pale, unnameable eyes and said quietly, "They will not remove me." And, "Why?" I said, each word its own complete and separate sentence. "Will they not?" He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a small flat case. He opened it and held it toward me without a word. Inside was a single card, heavy cream stock, engraved with a crest I recognized instantly because I had spent the past 2 days staring at that exact crest on every official document in the estate study. The Greyvorn crest. And beneath it, in clean engraved lettering, a name, Casveth Dorn, Duke of Greyvorn. The ground did not move beneath my feet, but every other certainty I possessed shifted violently sideways in the space of one heartbeat. I looked at the card. I looked at him. I looked at the card once more. Behind me, Mr. Pendrath finally spoke. His voice was very quiet and extremely careful. "My lady, may I present His Grace, the Duke of Greyvorn, the Master of Thornvale Estate." The Master of Thornvale Estate. The man I had just commanded to be dragged off his own land. And then, with the slow and merciless clarity of a candle being held up to a dark painting, I remembered the portrait at the top of the stairs, the one obscured by shadow and water damage, the one I had walked past without stopping. Because if I had stopped, if I had looked closely enough to make out the face beneath all that shadow and damage, I would have seen this face, these sharp angles, these pale, unnameable eyes. Duke Casveth Dorn of Greyvorn was not dead. He was not missing. He was not a legal abstraction on a page of trustee documents. He was standing 4 feet in front of me, and he had just watched me order his own household staff to throw him off his property. Before I could speak, before I could arrange my face into anything resembling composure, he did something I did not expect. He stepped forward, reached past me with one deliberate hand, and took hold of the heavy ceremonial outer gown I had draped across my shoulders that morning. The one bearing the official custodian seal of the Greyvorn trustees, the garment that had been delivered to me along with my letter of appointment as a symbol of my authority over this estate. He lifted it from my shoulders in one clean, unhurried motion and held it at his side. Every person watching went absolutely silent. The cold morning air hit my shoulders immediately. I did not move. I could not move. He looked at me with those eyes and spoke in a voice so low and so composed that it was somehow worse than shouting. The custodianship of Thornvale Estate is hereby returned to its rightful owner. You, Lady Thessaly Crow, are no longer required to carry that burden. He held the ceremonial gown out to Mr. Pendrith without looking away from my face. I stood in the courtyard of Thornvale Estate with the cold air on my shoulders and the full weight of every watching eye pressing down on me, and I did the only thing my pride would allow. I lifted my chin. I met his gaze without flinching, and I said in a perfectly steady voice, "Then I shall require a full written accounting of your return, Your Grace, before I vacate a single room." Something shifted in those pale eyes, something quick and almost imperceptible. And then he said, very quietly, "As you wish." He turned and walked into his house, and I stood in his courtyard and told myself very firmly that I was not going to let this destroy me. I was lying, of course, but it was a necessary lie, and it was only the beginning. I did not vacate a single room. That was not stubbornness for its own sake. I had a legal basis for remaining at Thornvale, and I intended to use every inch of it. My letter of appointment from the trustees did not dissolve simply because the Duke had returned and removed a ceremonial gown from my shoulders in front of his entire household staff. The appointment required a formal written revocation, signed by no fewer than 3 trustees and delivered through proper legal channels. Until that document existed, I was still, technically, the acting custodian of this estate. I sent a letter to the head trustee, Lord Brecon-Solm, before the morning was half done. I outlined the Duke's return, the circumstances of our introduction, and my intention to remain on the premises until proper legal procedure had been followed to the letter. I sealed it, handed it to Otby, and instructed him to ride to the post himself rather than leaving it with the regular messenger. Otby looked terrified. He looked at me, then in the direction of the study where the Duke had disappeared, then back at me. He took the letter and left at a pace that suggested he was grateful for any excuse to be temporarily elsewhere. I did not blame him. The atmosphere inside Thornvale had changed completely the moment Casveth Dorn crossed the threshold. It was not loud. It was not violent. It was something quieter and more unsettling than either of those things. It was the feeling of a house remembering who it actually belonged to, every timber and stone and shadow reorienting itself around a new center of gravity. I refused to reorient myself around anything. I returned to the estate study, sat down at the writing desk that I had been using for 2 days, opened the ledger that I had been working through the previous evening, and continued exactly where I had left off. If the Duke wanted me gone, he would need to produce the correct paperwork. Until then, I had work to do. I had been sitting there for perhaps 40 minutes when the door opened. Not knocked. Opened. I looked up. It was not the Duke. It was the serious-looking man who had arrived with him, the one who had carried the leather traveling case. Up close, he was older than I had initially judged, somewhere past 50, with a hard and weathered face and small, very sharp eyes that moved around the room with the quick efficiency of someone cataloging everything they saw. He was well-dressed, but not elaborately so. He carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who derives his authority not from rank, but from knowledge, specifically the kind of knowledge that other people would prefer he did not have. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Lady Crow," he said. "Not a greeting, an identification." "You have the advantage of me," I replied, setting down my quill but not rising. Rising would have suggested I considered him a social equal deserving of formal courtesy. I did not yet know what he was, and until I did, I would remain seated and let him explain himself. "My name is Dravet," he said, "solicitor to His Grace the Duke of Greyvorn. I have managed the Duke's legal affairs for the past 11 years. He paused just long enough to let that sit. "I am also the individual who filed the original petition with the trustees that led to your appointment here." I went very still. "I beg your pardon," I said. "The Duke's absence was deliberate," Dravet said, moving to the chair across the desk without being invited and sitting down with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in rooms he had not been welcomed into. "It was also legally protected by a private arrangement between His Grace and the senior trustee, an arrangement that was, unfortunately, not communicated to the full board. When the junior trustees grew concerned and began pushing for custodial intervention, the matter moved faster than anticipated. Your appointment was, from our perspective, an administrative error." I stared at him. "An administrative error?" I repeated. "A regrettable one," he said, without a trace of actual regret. "You are telling me," I said slowly, "that I was sent here, given legal authority over this estate, provided with a ceremonial garment representing that authority, installed in this house, and set to work on the Duke's affairs, all because of an administrative error. That is correct. And the Duke knew I was here." Dravet's small, sharp eyes did not move. "He was informed upon his arrival this morning." Which meant the Duke had known exactly who I was before he ever walked through that gate. He had known I was here. He had known I believed myself to be in authority. And he had walked in anyway, said nothing to correct the situation until I had fully humiliated myself, and then removed my gown in front of his entire staff. He had let it happen, every moment of it, deliberately. The anger that moved through me in that moment was so clean and so complete that it almost felt like calm. "Get out of this room," I said pleasantly. Dravet raised one eyebrow. "My lady, there are matters we must discuss regarding the formal transfer of—" "Get out," I said again, with precisely the same pleasantness. "And tell your Duke that if he wishes to discuss the transfer of custodial authority, he may do so in writing, through the trustees, through proper legal channels, exactly as the law requires. I will not be managed by a solicitor who enters rooms without knocking." A long pause. Then Dravet rose, inclined his head by the smallest possible margin, and left. The moment the door closed, I put both hands flat on the desk and breathed. Because something Dravet had said was pulling at me like a thread caught on a nail. The Duke's absence was deliberate, legally protected by a private arrangement, an arrangement not communicated to the full board. Why? Why would a Duke arrange a deliberate, legally protected absence from his own estate for 3 full years? What kind of man does that? What was he hiding from? Or what was he hiding? I pulled the estate ledger toward me and began reading it again. This time not as an administrator looking for debts and damages, but as someone looking for something that did not belong. I found it on the 47th page. A series of payments, recorded quarterly, each one listed simply as a settlement disbursement with no name attached and no further explanation. They were not small amounts. Each one represented a sum that would have kept the West Wing roof in perfect repair for an entire year. They had been going out of the estate accounts consistently, every 3 months, for 4 years. Someone was being paid to stay quiet, and I had a very strong feeling that whatever they were staying quiet about had everything to do with why the Duke of Gravorn had arranged to disappear from his own life for 3 years. I closed the ledger carefully. I looked at the door, and I made a decision that I already knew was going to change everything. I was not leaving Thornvale, not until I understood exactly what I had walked into. By evening, the house had divided itself into 2 camps, as cleanly as if someone had drawn a line down the center of the great hall with chalk. On one side was the Duke's camp. Dravet, who had taken up residence in the east sitting room with his leather case and his sharp cataloging eyes. The young luggage carrier, whose name turned out to be Pell, and who moved through the corridors with the nervous energy of someone permanently braced for disaster. And the Duke himself, who had spent the entire day in the estate study after I vacated it, with the door closed and no meals taken, and not a single sound emerging that any of the hovering housemaids could report back to me with any useful detail. On my side was considerably less. Otby, who had returned from the post and attached himself to my cause with the loyalty of someone who had not yet worked out that my cause might be losing. And, surprisingly, one of the housemaids, a sharp-eyed young woman named Gretel, who brought me my supper on a tray, without being asked, and set it down with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already chosen her allegiance and was not interested in discussing it. Mr. Pendrath remained firmly neutral. That was, I supposed, the only reasonable position for a man who had served this household for 31 years and intended to continue serving it for 31 more. Mr. Quebb had not reappeared at all. I suspected he had found something urgent to do as far from the main house as the estate grounds would permit. I ate my supper at the small table in the corner of the guest chamber and thought about those quarterly payments in the ledger and the name that was not attached to any of them. Somebody knew that name. Somebody in this house or connected to this estate knew exactly who had been receiving those payments and why. The question was who, and whether they could be persuaded to tell me before the trustees responded to my letter, and the situation was resolved in a way that removed me from the premises entirely. I had until the trustees responded. That was my window, and I intended to use it. I was still thinking through my approach when Gretel came back for the supper tray and paused at the door on her way out with an expression that told me she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "Gretel," I said. "Whatever it is, say it plainly. I have no patience this evening for anything that is not plain." She straightened. "There is a woman, my lady. She arrived at the servants' entrance an hour ago. She asked specifically for the acting custodian of the estate. She does not know yet that His Grace has returned." I set down my fork. "Who is she?" She would not give her name, but she gave this. Gretel reached into her apron pocket and produced a small folded card. I took it and opened it. Written inside in a tight, urgent hand were 4 words. "I know about Gravorn." I looked up at Gretel. "Bring her to me. Now. And do not let anyone else in the household know she is here." Gretel nodded and left. The woman who arrived in my chamber 10 minutes later was not what I expected. I had been anticipating someone frightened, someone who moved like a person accustomed to hiding. Instead, she walked in with her back straight and her chin at an angle that reminded me, unsettlingly, of myself. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair shot through with silver and the kind of face that had once been very beautiful, and had since become something more formidable than beauty. She sat down across from me without being invited, which was becoming a theme in my experience of Thornvale. "My name is Countess Bryvane Ostler," she said. "And before you ask, no, I am not here to cause trouble. I am here because the trouble already exists, and somebody needs to stop it before it consumes this entire estate and everyone connected to it." "Go on," I said. 3 years ago," she said, "Casveth Dorn was presented with evidence that someone within his own household had been systematically selling information about the Greyvorn family to a man named Raoul Casveth. Do you know that name?" I did not. I shook my head. "Raoul Casveth is a financier," she said, "and a collector. Not of art or antiquities, of secrets. He acquires information about noble families, damaging information, and he uses it to extract money, favors, and influence. He has been doing it for years, very quietly, very carefully, and the families he targets rarely speak of it because speaking of it requires admitting what he knows." "And he targeted Greyvorn," I said. "He did not merely target Greyvorn," she said. "He targeted the Duke personally. He acquired evidence of something that happened 12 years ago, something that, if made public, would not simply damage the Duke's reputation. It would destroy it completely. And the Duke, rather than pay indefinitely, chose to remove himself from public life long enough to find out who inside his household had given Casveth the information in the first place." Everything in me went quiet. "The quarterly payments in the ledger," I said. Her eyes sharpened. "You found those?" "I found them. No names attached." "Those payments go to Casveth," she said. "They have been going since the arrangement began. The Duke has been paying to keep the information suppressed while his solicitor worked to identify the source of the leak." "Dravette," I said. "Yes." "And have they identified the source?" Countess Bryvane Ostler looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "That is precisely why I am here, Lady Crow. Because the source of the leak is still inside this house. They were here when I arrived this evening, and they are now aware that the Duke has returned." The candle on the table between us flickered, though there was no draft in the room. "Who is it?" I said. She opened her mouth to answer, and at that exact moment, the door to my chamber swung open. Duke Casveth Dorn stood in the doorway. He was not in his travel coat any longer. He had changed, and the difference was striking in a way I refused to examine too closely. His eyes moved from me to Countess Bryvane Ostler, and something passed across his face so quickly that I nearly missed it. He had not expected her to be here, and from the way Countess Bryvane Ostler's back went completely rigid the moment she saw him, she had not expected to be caught. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Then the Duke spoke, and his voice was very quiet and very dangerous. "Bryvane," he said. "What exactly have you told her?" Countess Bryvane Ostler rose slowly from her chair and turned to face him with the composure of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. "The truth," she said, "which is more than you have managed." I sat between them and understood, with a cold and absolute certainty, that I was no longer simply an administrator caught in an administrative error. I was sitting at the center of something that had been building for 3 years. Something with money and secrets and a leak that had not yet been named. Something dangerous enough that a Duke had erased himself from his own life rather than face it unprepared. And I had walked straight into the middle of it with my ledger and my sealed letter of appointment and my ceremonial gown, which was currently folded over a chair in the corridor outside, because Mr. Pendrath had quietly returned it to me an hour after the Duke had taken it, without explanation, without any message attached. I looked at the Duke standing in my doorway. I looked at Countess Bryvane Ostler standing between us. And I said in the steadiest voice I owned, "I think the 3 of us need to sit down." Neither of them moved. "Now," I said, and to my very great surprise, they both sat down. Nobody spoke for a long moment after we all sat down. The candle between us burned steadily. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the old oak trees along the entrance path with a sound like distant whispering. The house around us had gone into that particular late evening quiet that large old buildings settle into, every creak and shift amplified by the stillness. I looked at the Duke. He was sitting in the chair that Countess Bryvane Osler had vacated, and he was looking at her with an expression I could not fully read. It was not anger, though anger was somewhere underneath it. It was the expression of a man who had spent 3 years building a careful, precise plan and had just watched someone walk into the middle of it and rearrange several important pieces without permission. Countess Bryvane Osler was looking back at him with equal steadiness and considerably less apology than the situation seemed to call for. I was looking at both of them and waiting. "You are going to tell her my name," the Duke said to Bryvane. Not a question. "I was going to tell her the name of the person who sold your secrets to Casveth," Bryvane replied. "Which is not your name." "It would have led her there eventually." "Then perhaps that is where she needed to be led. That is not your decision to make." "Someone had to make it," Bryvane said, and for the first time her composure shifted. Just slightly. Just enough to let through something that had been sitting behind it for a long time. "You have been managing this alone for 3 years, Casveth. 3 years of payments and silence and legal maneuvering and deliberate disappearance. And where has it brought you? Back to your own house, which has half a collapsed roof, a woman you tried to embarrass at the gate, and Casveth still breathing and still dangerous." The Duke said nothing. I looked at him. "She is right that you knew I was here before you arrived this morning." He turned those pale eyes to me. "Yes." "You knew I believed I had full authority over this estate." "Yes." "And you chose to let me stand in that courtyard and order your staff to remove you, knowing full well what the outcome would be." A pause. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I needed to see what you were made of." The sheer audacity of that answer took my breath away for a full 3 seconds. "You needed to see what I was made of," I repeated. "I had read your record before I arrived, Lady Crow. The Calderton administration, Hawbury Manor. You have a reputation for finding things that people attempt to hide inside the financial records of troubled estates. I needed to know if that reputation was accurate, or merely a convenient legend." I stared at him. "And the gown? Removing my custodial gown in front of your entire staff. Was that also a test?" Something moved through his expression. "That," he said after a moment, "was not my finest decision." It was such a plain and unexpected admission that I did not immediately know what to do with it. Bryvane made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "The quarterly payments?" I said, pulling myself back to the ground. "They go to Raoul Casveth. You have been paying him for 3 years to suppress whatever he has against you. What is it?" The Duke looked at the candle. Then he looked at me. And then he told me. 12 years ago, Casveth Dorn had witnessed something he was never supposed to witness. A meeting, conducted in secret on the grounds of a neighboring estate, between 3 men of significant rank and a foreign representative whose presence in England at that time was not merely politically inconvenient but criminally so. The meeting involved the exchange of information that, in a time of conflict, would have been considered treasonous. Casveth had been 22 years old. He had documented what he saw, named the men involved, and taken that documentation to a senior member of the government with whom his family had a long-standing connection. The matter had been handled, quietly. The men involved had been removed from their positions through carefully arranged means that avoided public scandal. Casveth had been assured that his role in the matter was sealed, protected, and would never be connected to him. What he had not been told was that one of the 3 men at that meeting had a son, A son who had spent 12 years quietly and methodically working out who had destroyed his father, and who had eventually found Raoul casqued and paid him to discover the answer. The son's name was Lord Farron Dusk. And Lord Farron Dusk, I now understood with a cold drop of clarity, was one of the 3 junior trustees who had pushed for custodial intervention at Thornvale. He had pushed for it not out of concern for the estate. He had pushed for it to get someone inside this house, someone who would look through the records and unknowingly disturb things that the Duke had carefully left in place as part of a larger legal trap he had been constructing with Dravette for 2 years. I had been put here to be a disturbance, to flush something out. Farron Dusk wanted someone inside this estate going through the records, I said. He thought a custodian would find whatever he needed found and bring it to the trustees without understanding what it was. Yes, the Duke said. But I found the payments instead and recognized them for what they were. Which is precisely what I hoped you would do. I looked at him for a long moment. You hoped I would find them. I left them where someone with your particular skills would find them within 48 hours. The room was very quiet. The leak, I said. The person inside this house who sold your secrets to Casqued in the first place. Who is it? Bryvane and the Duke exchanged a look. Then the Duke said, Dravette. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Your own solicitor, I said. My father's solicitor first. Dravette served the Greyvorn household long before I inherited. He was passed to me along with everything else. He had access to every private document, every family matter, every sealed correspondence. When Farron Dusk came looking for information 11 years ago, Dravette was the one who answered. And you discovered this? Because Bryvane told me, he said. 3 years ago. I turned to Bryvane. And how did you know? Because Farron Dusk told me himself, she said quietly. He believed I was sympathetic to his cause. We had a prior acquaintance, and he trusted me more than he should have. When I understood what he was doing and what Dravette had done, I came to Casveth immediately. So Dravette does not know that you know, I said to the Duke. No. And he is still here, in this house, tonight. Yes. I stood up from my chair. Both of them looked at me. Then we are going to end this tonight, I said. Not tomorrow, not through correspondence with the trustees. Tonight. Because Dravette has been in this house since this morning, and he knows those ledgers as well as anyone. If he suspects for even a moment that those payment records have been found and understood, he will find a way to destroy them before morning, and your legal trap will have nothing left to close around. The Duke stood. He was quiet for a moment, looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. It was not fun. It was not the measured calculation he had worn all day. It was something simpler and considerably more difficult to look at directly. You would help me, he said. After this morning. I am not helping you, I said firmly. I am completing the work I was sent here to do, which is to restore this estate to proper order. And proper order, as it turns out, requires removing a traitor from the premises. I paused. Formally, with documentation, through correct legal procedure. The corner of his mouth moved. Of course. We moved quickly after that. The plan was this. I would go to Dravette with the ledger and present the payment records as something I had found confusing and needed his expertise to explain. Dravette, believing I was still simply an administrator without full knowledge of the situation, would attempt to provide a false explanation. The Duke, with Bryvane as witness, would be in the adjoining room. Otby would be positioned in the corridor with a sealed written record of everything found in the ledger, ready to be dispatched to both the trustees and the magistrate the moment we had Dravette's false explanation on record. It was not a complicated plan, but it required me to sit across from a man I now knew to be a traitor and a liar and ask him questions in a calm and unconcerned voice, while the Duke of Greyvorn listened through a wall. I had done harder things. I told myself that very firmly on the way down the corridor. Dravet was still in the east sitting room. He looked up when I entered with the ledger under my arm and the expression of a woman who needed professional guidance on a confusing accounting matter. His sharp eyes moved to the ledger immediately. Something shifted behind them. "Lady Crow," he said, "it is rather late for the estate business." "I know," I said, sitting down across from him with the ledger open to page 47. "But I found something this afternoon that I cannot make sense of, and I am afraid it has been troubling me all evening. I know you have managed the Duke's affairs for many years, and I thought you would be the right person to explain these payments to me." I turned the ledger to face him. He looked at the page, and in the 2 seconds before he arranged his expression into something helpful and cooperative, I saw it. The quick, controlled flash of a man who has just discovered that the ground beneath him is considerably less solid than he believed. "Ah," he said. "Yes. These are routine settlement disbursements relating to a long-standing land dispute in the northern quarter of the estate. Entirely ordinary. I can provide you with the full documentation tomorrow morning if you—" "There is no land dispute in the northern quarter," I said pleasantly. "I have been through every document in this study and there is no record of any such dispute. Perhaps you are thinking of a different estate?" Silence. "Furthermore," I said, "these payments began 4 years ago. The land dispute records I do have access to show no unresolved northern matter of any kind at that time. So I am wondering, Mr. Dravet, if you might help me understand where exactly these very significant sums have been going." He looked at me, and then his eyes moved, just briefly, to the wall on his left. He knew. I did not let my expression change. "Mr. Dravet?" He stood up slowly. "Lady Crow, I think perhaps this conversation would be better conducted in the morning, with the Duke present, when—" The door opened. The Duke walked in. Dravet went completely still. "Sit down, Dravet," the Duke said. His voice was so quiet it was almost gentle. That made it worse. "We have a great deal to discuss. And I think you already know that this conversation has been a long time coming." Dravet sat. And everything that followed was not loud or dramatic in the way that confrontations in novels tend to be. It was quiet and precise and thorough. The way that true reckonings always are when they have been built carefully over a long time. Dravet denied. Then he deflected. Then, when the Duke placed before him the full extent of the documented evidence that he and Dravet had been assembling across 3 years of careful legal work, he went very silent and did not speak again except to say, in a voice stripped of everything it had previously contained, that he wanted a solicitor of his own. Otby had already left for the magistrate by the time that request was made. Lord Farron Dusk was taken into custody 2 days later, having made the significant error of arriving at Thornvale unannounced on the morning following Dravet's exposure, apparently intending to retrieve something from the estate records before the situation became irreversible. He found the Duke, 2 magistrates' officers, and me, standing in the entrance hall waiting for him with a patience that I believe he found deeply unsettling. Raoul Casveth, informed by his own sources that the situation had collapsed, attempted to leave the county. He did not succeed. 3 weeks passed. They were not quiet weeks. There were magistrate visits and trustee letters and formal legal proceedings that required my presence as a witness on 4 separate occasions. There were repairs begun on the West Wing roof at last, with funds properly released, now that the estate accounts were no longer hemorrhaging money toward Casveth every quarter. There were tenant meetings and creditor negotiations, and a thorough reorganization of the household accounts that kept Otby's quill moving from early morning until well past dark each day. I told myself I was still here because the work was not finished. That was true. It was also not the only reason, but I was not prepared to examine the other reasons too carefully. The Duke and I had developed, across those 3 weeks, a working arrangement that was difficult to name and easy to misread. We met each morning in the estate study to go through the day's correspondence together. We disagreed frequently. He had opinions about the management of the tenant properties that I found overly rigid, and I had approaches to the creditor negotiations that he found unnecessarily confrontational, and we told each other so with a directness that seemed to surprise both of us in equal measure each time it happened. He never told me to leave. I never told him I intended to stay. The arrangement simply continued, day by day, held together by work and a mutual refusal to acknowledge that there was anything more than work holding it together. Mr. Pendreth watched all of this with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had seen a great many things in 31 years of service and had learned the wisdom of keeping his observations entirely to himself. Gretel was considerably less restrained. She had taken to leaving 2 cups of tea on the study desk each morning instead of 1, without comment, as though this were something that had always been done and required no explanation. Countess Bryvane Ostler had returned to her own estate the morning after Dravet's exposure, but she had left me a note. It said only, "He is not what the 3 years made him look like. He is what he was before them. I think you already know the difference." I folded the note and put it in my traveling case, and did not read it again, though I thought about it rather more than was strictly sensible. The formal revocation of my custodial appointment arrived from the trustees on a gray Tuesday morning in the 4th week. It was correctly signed, properly sealed, and entirely legal. It dissolved my role as acting custodian of Thornvale Estate, effective at the end of the month, and expressed the board's gratitude for my service during a period of considerable institutional difficulty. Lord Farrandusk had, of course, already been removed from the board. His replacement was a quiet and thorough man named Sir Aubin Prelick, who had sent me a separate personal letter commending my role in the matter and noting that my conduct had been exemplary throughout. I set both letters on the desk and looked out of the window at the oak trees along the entrance path, which had gone fully golden now in the deepening autumn and were dropping their leaves in slow, unhurried drifts across the gravel. The west wing scaffolding was visible from this angle. The workers had made remarkable progress. Another 2 weeks, and the roof would be sound again for the first time in years. I would not be here to see it finished. I had begun to gather my things from the guest chamber that afternoon when the Duke appeared in the doorway. He had developed a habit, I had noticed, of appearing in doorways and waiting rather than entering immediately, as though giving the room a chance to adjust to his presence before he brought it fully in. "The revocation came," I said, without turning from the wardrobe I was reorganizing. "I know. I received a copy." "Then you know I will be gone by the end of the month." "I know that is what the document says." I turned then, because his tone had shifted slightly, and I had learned across 3 weeks that his tones were worth paying attention to. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms folded and his eyes on me with that expression I had come to recognize. The one that was not quite amusing and not quite something else, and occupied an uncomfortable amount of space between the two. "What are you not saying, Your Grace?" I asked. "I spoke with Sir Aubin Prelick this morning," he said. "The estate requires a formal administrator. Not a temporary custodian, but a permanent appointment. Someone with the appropriate experience and the particular skill of finding things that are hidden in places they should not be hidden." I looked at him. "The trustees have approved the position," he said. "It would require the appointed individual to be resident at Thornvale on a permanent basis. The role carries a formal title, appropriate compensation, and full legal standing in all estate matters." "You want me to stay," I said. "The trustees want you to stay," he said. "I am simply relaying the offer." "You are the one standing in my doorway relaying it." "Someone had to." I turned back to the wardrobe and stood very still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, while I arranged my thoughts into something resembling order. He had known I was here before he walked through that gate. He had read my record. He had left those payments where I would find them. He had constructed a situation that required exactly my kind of mind to navigate, and then he had placed me inside it and waited to see what I would do. He had removed my gown in that courtyard, and I had not flinched. I had asked for written documentation instead, and something in those pale, unnameable eyes had shifted in that moment. Quickly, almost invisibly, but I had seen it. I have thought about it every single day since. If I accept this position, I said carefully, I will run this estate according to my own methods. I will not be overruled on tenant matters without a full and reasoned argument. I will not be managed, redirected, or strategically positioned without my knowledge and consent, and I will require my own study, not the guest chamber. A proper study with adequate bookshelf space and a decent writing desk. A pause. The east study has better light, he said, and a larger desk. Then I will take the east study. Another pause. Longer this time. Lady Crow, he said. And something in the way he said it made me go still. It was not the tone he used for estate business. It was not even the tone he used for the careful, indirect conversations we had developed across 3 weeks of mornings with 2 cups of tea on the desk. It was quieter than both of those, and considerably more unguarded. I owe you an apology, for the courtyard, for the gown, for allowing you to walk into a situation I had partly designed without the courtesy of warning you first. It was not honorable, and you deserved better than that. I stood with my hand on the wardrobe door and looked at the wall in front of me. The thing about a real apology from a man who does not give them easily is that it lands differently than expected. It does not feel like victory. It feels like something opening that had been closed for a long time. You also left me the most interesting puzzle I have encountered in 6 years of estate work, I said. I am not entirely certain whether to thank you or continue being angry about it. You could do both, he said, simultaneously. I suspect you are capable of it. I turned around. He was still in the doorway, still with his arms folded, but the expression on his face was different from anything I had seen on it across all the days since his arrival. It was simpler, more undefended. The face of a man who had spent 3 years behind a wall of legal strategy and deliberate absence, and was, for perhaps the first time, standing somewhere without the wall in front of him. I thought about Bravain's note. He is what he was before them. I will accept the position, I said, on the conditions I stated. All of them are agreed, he said, including the East study. Including the East study. I nodded once. Then I suppose I had better unpack. Something crossed his face, quiet and quick and entirely genuine. Not the almost smile he had worn in the courtyard the morning of his return. Something warmer than that. Something that had been a long time getting there. He straightened from the doorway. Supper is at 7, he said. Mr. Pendrath has been holding the good dining room under a cover since the day I arrived, waiting for an occasion that warranted it. I believe this qualifies. He turned and walked back down the corridor without waiting for my response. I stood in the middle of the guest chamber that was no longer going to be my chamber, with my half-emptied traveling case on the bed and the golden oak leaves drifting past the window, and I permitted myself exactly 10 seconds of feeling something I was not yet ready to name. Then I closed the traveling case, picked up the East study key that Mr. Pendrath had somehow already left on the windowsill, and went to begin the rest of the work. Because Thornvale was not finished yet. Not even close. And neither, I was beginning to understand, were we?